Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 291. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Charlie Haden, Closeness, a series of duets with, as you can see, Ornette Coleman, Alice Coltrane, Keith Jarrett, and Paul Motian. It's one of two records. The companion record is called The Golden Number, which comes out a little bit later. Both are on Horizon Records, and this is a Canadian release from the year of issue 1976. This record is a very accessible record, ironically enough made by one of the real icons of the avant-garde jazz movement. But Charlie Haden is probably one of the least typical icons of avant-garde jazz there is. He comes from a background of being in a traveling family country and western show, ends up really at the epicenter, the ground zero of free jazz, first of all in LA and then in New York. And the magic of his music is basically taking his old-fashioned ear, honed in the family kitchen, and combining that with a great ability to follow and play off some of these incredibly adventurous soloists that he played with in the free jazz period. This record is a stunningly beautiful piece of work, made at a time in the mid-1970s when Haden was struggling with addiction and bereavement, but with the help of a lot of friends and collaborators and with the help of a label who had a sense of where he was and what kind of a setting would suit him, here he creates some of his finest work. Charlie Haden was born in Shenandoah, Iowa in 1937. He was born, as I mentioned, into a musical family who performed as the Haden family. Charlie began to perform with the band at the age of 2 as a yodeler known as Cowboy Charlie. And that lasts until he's 15 when polio takes away his singing voice and also affects some of his facial muscles. But as luck would have it, while the disease took away his country and western career, he'd already caught the jazz bug. Because the year before, in 1951, Norman Grantz's Jazz at the Philharmonic tour had come through Omaha, Nebraska, with Charlie Parker as a headliner. Charlie begins listening to all the jazz he can and collecting records. His early favorite was Hampton Hawes, the piano player, and he begins to learn jazz bass. Needless to say, he had affinity for the instrument, and by the time he graduated in 1955, he'd won a music scholarship to Oberlin, but he turned to Oberlin down so he can go to the Westlake College of Music in Los Angeles. He moved to LA in 1956 to attend Westlake. He's there at the same time as Gordon Lightfoot. I don't know if they ever jammed. I'd love to have been there if they had. On the club scene, he seeks out Hampton Hawes, whom he befriends, and he also makes friends with a number of other major players, including Art Pepper, the bass players Scott LaFaro and Red Mitchell, and the piano player, the Canadian Paul Bley. Around this point, Paul Bley, who had a group which included the vibe player Dave Pike and the drummer Lenny McBrown, had secured an extended gig at the Hillcrest Club, so Haden joins Bley playing at the Hillcrest. Soon after, Haden one night goes down to The Hague, which was a club, famous jazz club in LA, where Jerry Mulligan basically was the featured performer for years and years. And sitting in with Mulligan that night was a guy called Ornette Coleman. Coleman took the stage, began to play Ornette Coleman's music, which was pretty radical compared to what people were used to in the LA cool jazz scene, and was quickly hustled off the stage. Haden was transported by the music, goes up to Coleman and says, "Man, I thought that was beautiful." And Coleman apparently said, "Nobody ever tells me that." Haden goes to practice with Bley's group the next day, mentions the incident, and Lenny McBrown says, "Oh, that's Ornette Coleman, I'll introduce you." When they meet, it's an instant connection. They go to Coleman's house, they jam for days and days, and it's even in this early period where Haden begins to learn how to follow Coleman. If there were chord changes written down, which there were very few, he would follow those, but when Coleman left the chord changes and just said, "Follow me," he would find a way to connect to certain root notes that worked. And so here you have a guy who's really come out of a country and western background, who's bringing all that sensibility to Ornette Coleman's completely experimental work. And lo and behold, it works. Coleman, of course, was composing a ton, and Haden began to venture melodies where he felt they were missing in Coleman's work. And Coleman, notoriously prickly about this kind of stuff, was fine with Haden doing it. He could see they had this connection. And here you have this fulcrum, this crucible of the creation of free jazz. Initially, this leads to Ornette Coleman and one of his other colleagues, the trumpeter Don Cherry, joining Bley's group along with Haden in 1958. Coleman also had his own practice group, which includes Cherry and Haden, but he struggled to get gigs because of his sound. He does make a couple of records for Contemporary in 1958 and early 1959, but they don't really make much of a splash. But in the summer of '59, Coleman has a job working at a jazz workshop in Massachusetts, and he meets and befriends John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet. And Lewis, in turn, gets hold of Nasui Erdogan at Atlantic Records and says, "Nasui, you have to record this guy, Ornette Coleman." And so Coleman gets a recording date on Atlantic, and while Haden hadn't been part of his Contemporary Records recordings, he did ask Haden to come and be on this record, which becomes The Shape of Jazz to Come. That record, for Coleman and for Haden and for the other members of the group, leads to the big time, because what it does is generate an invitation to play at the Five Spot in Greenwich Village in November 1959, which of course becomes the infamous Battle of the Five Spot, in which these four free jazz hipsters from California show up and startle and frankly upset the Eastern jazz establishment. In a short period of time, Haden then goes on to play on several inspired Coleman records on Atlantic, but along the way, maybe from hanging out too much with people like Art Pepper earlier on, Haden has developed a drug habit. And by the end of 1960, despite, if not all this commercial success, certainly all this amazing impact, he has to leave Coleman's band, and eventually, after a couple of years, finds his way to rehab. He meets his first wife there, Ellen David, for whom one of the tracks on this record is named, and he gets his act together by about 1964. In the mid-1960s, he has a lot of work, but he's not playing with anybody regularly. But things start to solidify around 1967 when he rejoins Ornette Coleman, but perhaps more significantly also joins Keith Jarrett in what became known as Jarrett's American Quartet, along with Dewey Redman and the drummer Paul Motian. In 1969, he starts the remarkable Liberation Music Orchestra, working with Paul Bley's ex-wife, Carla Bley, who's a fantastic arranger and musician in her own right. His performances become very political, and this starts to attract heat, as it does from reactionary governments like the junta in Portugal and from the Nixon-era FBI. In the early 1970s, the work with Jarrett really began to blossom, and there are some amazing records that quartet puts out. Haden makes a profound contribution to the sound of that music, records like For Yawa, but things were also falling apart in other ways. In 1974, his father dies, and his marriage is also falling apart. And these events perhaps inevitably lead to a relapse into addiction. But fortunately, Charlie had good friends. John Snyder, who ran Horizon for A&M and is credited here as a creative director, had worked for Creed Taylor at CTI Records in the early 1970s, and A&M decided they wanted to do something like Taylor was doing, producing very contemporary, updated, and commercially viable jazz, beautifully packaged, beautifully produced, and so they lured Snyder away and created this Horizon imprint. Snyder very much wanted to have Charlie Haden lead a record, and he wanted to have Ed Michel, who had produced so many great records for Impulse, and was no longer with that label, to produce it. But both of them were aware that Haden was really struggling, and so they needed to find a way to make the circumstances fit Charlie's circumstances. Michel's suggestion was a duets record where the vibe and the environment would be more comfortable. The chosen artists are all longtime friends and collaborators of Haden's: Ornette Coleman, Paul Motian, Keith Jarrett, Alice Coltrane, and on the companion record, The Golden Number, Hampton Hawes, Archie Shepp, and Don Cherry. And you can tell just from the liner notes how much love is in the air. The duet with Alice Coltrane was recorded January 26, 1976 at Ken Dunn Recorders in Burbank. The other three tracks are recorded 2 months later in New York at Generation Sound. Keith Jarrett on March 18th, and Ornette Coleman and Paul Motian on March 21st. And the producer, as I mentioned, is Ed Michel. Side one starts with Ellen David, named for Charlie's soon-to-be ex-wife. This is the piece with Keith Jarrett. Jarrett's playing is remarkable. This is a beautiful, intimate, wistful piece of music, and also the recording quality is just pristine. I mean, you really do have those two instruments right there in front of you. The second track in side one, OC, is with Ornette Coleman, and what I get out of this track is just the joyousness. It's clearly a very happy thing whenever these two play together, and that just comes right out of the speakers. Side two begins with Forturia. This is a duet on which I find Haden's playing to be the most generous, knowing very well, as he did, the way that Alice liked to work. He just adopts a droning feel when that's what she needs and so on. I can't really describe it better other than to say this is some of the most chilled out, ecstatic music you're ever going to hear. The final track, For Free Portugal, is with Paul Motian, a studio track which also has other kinds of sounds layered over. One thing layered over is a dedication that he does at a concert in Portugal, actually the very dedication that gets him in trouble with the junta. There's also a guerrilla anthem and the sound of an attack on a Portuguese barracks. This track is of its time, and it obviously has to do with struggles that are far more important than any record. But as a piece of music, I find that it competes not very successfully with the other elements. And my slight quibble is I don't really get to hear Paul Motian as much as I would like to. This record is a fascinating time capsule from some of the major architects of the free jazz and astral jazz scenes. It's intimate, calm, beautiful music with the greatest dynamics being, unsurprisingly, on the piece with Ornette Coleman. It's a must for any fans of Charlie Haden's bass and really for any fans of any of the players here. As I mentioned, while the shorter track with Motian isn't necessarily one I'd return to often, the other tracks are flawless, and for me this record is 4.5 out of 5 stars.